The toast was a lie. Harriet Lockhart stood a pace behind her aunt's chair, a ghost in grey bombazine, and listened to the words drip like honeyed poison into the dining room. "To my brilliant niece, Louisa," her uncle, Sir Abbot Bellamy, announced, lifting his glass, "whose deft management of our little household has allowed us to invest so wisely in the new shipping concern." A murmur of polite applause went through the dozen guests. Louisa, radiant in silk the color of a summer sky, dipped her head in a perfect gesture of blushing modesty. Harriet felt a familiar, cold stillness settle in her chest. It was she, Harriet, who had spent 3 weeks poring over ledgers, cross-referencing cargo manifests, and identifying the single shipping company with sound fundamentals among a sea of speculation. It was she who had drafted the letters, calculated the returns, and presented the final, flawless proposal to Sir Abbot, who had merely grunted and signed his name. Louisa's only contribution had been to complain that the smell of ink from Harriet's corner of the morning room gave her a headache. Harriet did not move. She did not flinch. Her role was to be invisible, a silent cog in the Bellamy household machine. As the guests turned back to their conversations, Louisa shifted in her seat, her silken sleeve catching the stem of her wineglass. With a small gasp, the dark red liquid arced through the air, splashing directly onto the bodice of Harriet's plain dress. A stain bloomed like a dark, ugly flower. "Oh, you clumsy thing!" Louisa cried, but her eyes, flicking towards her mother, held a spark of careless triumph. Lady Honora Bellamy, Harriet's aunt, made a sound of theatrical exasperation. "Harriet, for heaven's sake, go and see to it. You are a distraction." There was no apology. There never was. With quiet, practiced movements, Harriet retrieved a napkin from the sideboard, blotted the stain to prevent it from spreading, and curtsied. "My apologies, Aunt Honora. Sir Abbot?" She backed away from the table, her exit as unobtrusive as her presence had been. In the hall, the cold air from the flagstones seeped through the thin soles of her shoes. She did not cry. She had learned long ago, at the age of 10 when her parents' death had delivered her into her aunt's care, that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value. Competence was the only thing that mattered. Salt and cool water, dabbed gently, would lift most of the stain before it set. That was a fact. Her aunt's cruelty was also a fact. One simply had to be dealt with more methodically than the other. As she turned towards the servants' stairs, a low voice stopped her. "A moment." She turned back. Leaning against the wall, half swallowed by the shadows outside the dining room's glow, was a man she had noticed earlier. He was unlike the other guests, the preening country squires and merchants. This man was tall and still, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and left out in the wind. His clothes were dark, exquisitely tailored, but devoid of fashion's fripperies. He held his wineglass with a kind of grim patience, as if it were a duty. She knew who he was, of course. Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase. A man whose name was spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. A war hero, a widower, and the owner of half the county, though he rarely visited. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were fixed on her. Not with pity, which she would have despised, but with a flat, unnerving curiosity. "That was not your fault," he stated. It was not a question. Harriet's first instinct was to murmur a denial, to smooth the situation over as she had been trained to do. But something in his direct gaze demanded an equally direct response. "Fault is of little consequence, Your Grace. The result is the same." He considered this, his gaze dropping to the dark stain on her dress, then returning to her face. "You manage this household's finances." Again, not a question. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold hallway prickled her skin. How could he possibly know that? She was a shadow, a whisper. "I assist my uncle, Sir Abbot," she said, the carefully worded lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "You do not assist him," the Duke corrected, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute weight of command. "You do the work. He takes the credit. Your cousin receives the toast. A neat, if unjust, economy." He pushed himself off the wall, his height and presence suddenly filling the narrow hall. He was closer now, close enough for her to see the fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes, lines of pain or exhaustion, or both. "Tomorrow at 10, bring your aunt's household ledgers to the library. All of them." Harriet's heart gave a painful thump. "Your Grace, I cannot. They are my uncle's private property." "Sir Abbot is desperate for my favor. He will not refuse me," the Duke said, his tone dismissing her uncle as a complete irrelevance. "I am not interested in his secrets. I am interested in your work. 10 o'clock, Miss Lockhart." He knew her name. The fact was so startling that for a moment she could not find her voice. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and moved past her, melting back into the shadows from which he had emerged. Harriet stood alone in the hall, her hand pressed against the damp, cold stain on her dress, the Duke's quiet, authoritative words echoing in the sudden silence. He had seen her. When no one else bothered to look, he had seen her. And she could not decide if it was the most terrifying or the most hopeful thing that had ever happened to her. The next morning, the air in the Bellamy house was thick with a nervous energy that emanated directly from Lady Honora. The Duke of Kestrel Chase, having accepted their dinner invitation, had then compounded the honor by staying the night and requesting a private meeting with Sir Abbot. Lady Honora was flustered, preening, and vicious by turns. She snapped at the maids for dust that wasn't there and criticized the cook's choice of breakfast, all while planning the outfits she and Louisa would wear in the hopes of accidentally encountering the Duke on the grounds. At 5 minutes to 10, Harriet stood before the library door, a heavy stack of leather-bound ledgers in her arms. As the Duke had predicted, Sir Abbot had blustered for a moment before caving instantly to the ducal request. "Show him whatever he wants, girl," he'd hissed at Harriet. "Just don't bore him." Taking a steadying breath, Harriet knocked. "Enter." The voice was as clipped and devoid of warmth as she remembered. The Duke was standing by the window, staring out at the manicured lawns. He did not turn as she entered. "Place them on the desk." She did as she was told, arranging the heavy books in a neat row on the polished mahogany. The silence stretched. Outside, a bird sang. Inside, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She waited, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her posture poised and still. Finally, he turned. His pale eyes swept over her, then the books. "This is a complete record of the past 5 years?" "Yes, Your Grace. Income, expenditure, investments, and household accounts." He walked to the desk and opened the topmost ledger. Harriet knew the one. It detailed the last 12 months of household spending. Every candle, every pound of flour, every yard of ribbon for Louisa's gowns. He flipped a few pages, his long fingers tracing a column of figures. He was not skimming, he was reading. "The cost of coal has risen 17% in the last year," he observed, his gaze still on the page. "Yet your expenditure has only increased by 4%. I arranged a bulk purchase contract with the colliery at Dunsmuir directly, Your Grace, Harriet explained, her voice even. It cut out the local merchant's fee. I also had the chimneys in the west wing swept and repaired. They were drawing poorly and wasting a great deal of heat. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold appraisal in his eyes. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Who repaired them? A man from the village, Ned. He is considered unreliable, but he is a master at his trade. He has a weakness for gin. I paid him half in advance, and the other half upon my personal inspection of every flue, with a bottle of his preferred brand as a bonus for finishing 2 days ahead of schedule. He has been sober and punctual for every job here since. The Duke closed the ledger. The sound was a soft, definitive thud in the quiet room. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long, unnerving minute. I have an estate, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Sorrel Down. It lies 15 miles west of here. It is a ruin, not the house itself, but its finances. I have employed 3 stewards in 5 years. The first was a fool, the second a drunkard, and the third a thief. It loses me £400 a year. It is a blight on my name and a drain on my resources. He paused, his grey eyes holding hers. I am done with fools, drunkards, and thieves. I am done with men who tell me what I wish to hear. I require a different solution. Harriet waited, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had no idea where this was going, but a strange, wild possibility was beginning to dawn in her mind. I am offering you a contract, Miss Lockhart, he said plainly. You will go to Sorrel Down. You will act as its steward, with my full and absolute authority vested in you. You will have access to all its records, its staff, its lands. Your task is to make it profitable. You have 2 years. Harriet's breath caught in her throat. A steward? A woman? The idea was scandalous, unheard of. If you fail, he continued, his tone utterly devoid of sentiment, you will be dismissed. You will leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. If you succeed, if at the end of 2 years Sorrel Down shows a net profit for 4 consecutive quarters, the estate becomes yours. Not to manage, yours. The deed, the house, the lands, and a trust yielding £500 per annum for its upkeep. A gift, in perpetuity. She stared at him, speechless. Freedom. Not just escape from her aunt, but true independence. A home. A future. It was a prize beyond her wildest imaginings. It was also an impossible task. Why? She finally managed to whisper. Why me? Because you understand that repairing a chimney can save more money than a dozen shrewd investments, he said. Because you know how to manage an asset, whether it is a ton of coal or an unreliable bricklayer. And because when your cousin ruined your dress and your aunt insulted you, you did not weep. You went to fetch the salt. I require competence, Miss Lockhart, not hysterics. And I prize evidence above all things. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk towards her. It was a contract, drafted in a lawyer's precise hand, outlining the exact terms he had just described. I require honesty above all else. Do not lie to me. In anything. He gestured to the paper. That is my offer. Your aunt will object to losing her unpaid accountant. I will handle your aunt. Your answer? Harriet looked from the contract, a black and white promise of a new life, to the Duke's implacable face. She thought of the endless, thankless years under Lady Honora's thumb. She thought of the spilled wine and the casual cruelty. She thought of the quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger, of a problem solved, of order brought from chaos. This was the greatest problem she had ever been presented with. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A fierce, exhilarating resolve. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. I accept, Your Grace. The journey to Sorrel Down was made in a hired coach, with Harriet's few belongings packed into a single trunk. Lady Honora had been apoplectic, her fury a terrifying storm of hissed insults and dire predictions. The Duke, true to his word, had handled her. He had not argued or raised his voice. He had simply sat in their drawing room for 10 minutes, spoken 2 or 3 sentences in a voice too low for Harriet to overhear, and risen to leave. Lady Honora had been left white-faced and silent, a statue of thwarted rage. Harriet had been permitted to depart. As the coach rattled along the rutted lane that led to the estate, the landscape began to change. The neat, prosperous fields of the Bellamy holdings gave way to overgrown hedgerows and fallow pastures. The trees seemed to crowd closer to the road, their branches bare and skeletal against the gray sky. When the coachman finally pulled the weary horses to a halt before a pair of rusted wrought-iron gates, one of which hung drunkenly from a single hinge, Harriet's heart sank. The house was visible at the end of a long, weed-choked drive. Sorrel Down. It was a handsome stone manor, Elizabethan in origin, with large, mullioned windows that stared out like vacant eyes. But it was a beauty that was deeply, profoundly neglected. Ivy crept unchecked over the walls, threatening to swallow entire windows. The slate roof was patched with moss, and a shutter on the second floor banged a mournful, rhythmic tattoo in the wind. An elderly man, his face a road map of wrinkles, shuffled out of a small gatehouse to open the one functioning gate. He looked at Harriet, then at her modest luggage, with an expression of deep, weary skepticism. He had seen stewards come and go. She was just one more, and an unlikely one at that. The front door was opened by a woman who looked as grim and unyielding as the house itself. She was stout, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her features taut. Her apron was clean, but her expression was sour. I am Harriet Lockhart, Harriet said, stepping into the cavernous, freezing hall. The air smelled of damp stone and disuse. The new steward. The woman's eyes narrowed. I'm Mrs. Ingram, housekeeper. The word was a challenge. His Grace sent word. Your rooms are in the east wing. They're aired, but there's no fire lit, no staff to spare for it. Harriet looked around the great hall. A thick layer of dust covered every surface. The grand fireplace was a black, empty maw. The portraits on the walls were obscured by grime. It was a house holding its breath, waiting to die. How many staff are there, Mrs. Ingram? Harriet asked. Myself, my husband who tends the grounds when his joints allow, and 2 girls from the village who come 3 days a week. There was more. They left. Not been paid regular in a year. Harriet nodded slowly. This was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just financial ruin. It was a complete collapse of morale. Where are the estate account books? Mrs. Ingram gestured with her chin towards a door off the hall. In the steward's office. what's left of them. The office was small, cold, and smelled of mice. A thick film of dust lay over the desk, the chair, the empty shelves. And on the desk sat a pile of ledgers. They were a disaster. Unlike the pristine books she had kept for her aunt, these were a nightmare of spilled ink, torn pages, and entries that stopped mid-sentence. One volume had a dark, spreading stain on its cover, as if it had been left out in the rain. Another had been gnawed at the corners by rodents. It was a perfect, physical manifestation of the estate's decay. Harriet ran a finger over the cover of the nearest book, leaving a clean track in the dust. This was it. This was the problem she had been sent to solve. For a moment, the sheer scale of the task threatened to overwhelm her. The cold, the hostility, the ruin. It was all pressing in. She thought of the Duke's face, his unnerving gray eyes, his plain-spoken contract. I require competence. She took off her bonnet and gloves, placing them on a corner of the desk. She rolled up the sleeves of her practical traveling dress. She would start here, with the evidence. For the next week, Harriet barely left the office. She rose before dawn, her breath misting in the cold air, and worked by the light of a single candle until long after the sun had set. She lit her own fire, fetched her own water. She asked Mrs. Ingram only for bread, cheese, and a pot of tea each day, which was delivered with a silent, grudging regularity. The books were a puzzle forged in negligence. She began with the least damaged ledger from 3 years prior. With painstaking care, she began to rebuild the story of Sorrel Down. She found receipts for livestock that were never recorded in the sales book. She found payments to tradesmen for work that was clearly never done. She found huge, unexplained sums listed under sundries. It was a litany of incompetence and theft. One evening, hunched over a page of cramped, spidery handwriting, trying to decipher a bill of lading, she felt a presence in the doorway. She looked up. It was Mrs. Ingram, holding a tray. "You'll ruin your eyes in this light," the housekeeper said, her voice rough. She set the tray down on the desk. On it was not just the usual bread and cheese, but a bowl of hot stew and a freshly lit oil lamp, its bright, clean light flooding the small room. Harriet stared at the unexpected offering. The stew smelled of rosemary and thyme. "Thank you, Mrs. Ingram." The housekeeper just grunted. "The last one, the thief. He spent his days out with his horse and his nights with a bottle. Never saw him touch a book. The one before that, the drunk, used him to prop up a wobbly table leg." Her gaze fell upon Harriet's work. Harriet had spent the afternoon carefully mending the torn pages of one ledger with fine thread and paste, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to the ragged tears. "Haven't seen anyone do that before." She turned and left without another word. But the next morning, the fire in the office grate had been lit before Harriet came down. It was a small thing, a single log burning in the cold, but it felt like a monumental victory. A tiny shift, a crack in the wall of ice. Harriet began to expand her work beyond the office. She walked the estate, a small notebook in hand. She discovered the home farm's dairy was producing good, rich milk that was being sold for a pittance in the village, barely covering the cost of the cow's feed. She walked the sheep pastures, noting the hardy, coarse-wooled breed that was unique to the area, wool that was being sold as undifferentiated scrap. And in a waterlogged field at the far western edge of the property, a place the previous stewards had written off as useless bog, she found it. Pushing aside a clump of reeds, she saw the exposed earth at the edge of a ditch. It was not the usual dark loam. It was a smooth, pale gray clay. She crumbled a piece between her fingers. It was fine-grained, almost silky. That night, she wrote her first letter to the Duke. It was not a plea for help or a litany of complaints. It was a report, concise, factual, and devoid of emotion. She detailed the state of the ledgers, the payroll discrepancies, and the baseline income. Then she listed the assets she had identified: the dairy, the wool, and the clay deposit. She included a small, dry sample of the clay wrapped in paper. She concluded with a precise 3-point plan for the next quarter. She asked for nothing. She simply stated what she was going to do. She sealed the letter and sent it with the weekly post from Kingsbrook. 2 weeks later, the Duke arrived, unannounced. He did not come to the front door. Harriet was in the high pasture, speaking with a taciturn shepherd named Jem about the lambing season, when she saw a lone rider approaching. It was the Duke, mounted on a magnificent black horse. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and handed the reins to Jem as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Your Grace," Harriet said, her composure only slightly ruffled by his sudden appearance. "Miss Lockhart." He gave a curt nod. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "Show me the clay." She led him to the boggy west field. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth. He stood at the edge of the ditch where she had made her discovery, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the overcast sky. He knelt, not caring about the mud on his fine wool trousers, and dug his bare fingers into the clay bank. He worked a small piece in his palm, his expression unreadable. "I sent your sample to a contact at the Wedgwood Potteries," he said, his voice quiet. "It is a superior grade of stoneware clay, highly desirable. They have been searching for a new domestic source for 2 years." Harriet's heart gave a leap. "Then it is valuable." "Potentially," he said, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "If it can be extracted economically. If there is enough of it. If you can negotiate a contract." He looked at her, his gray eyes intense. "Your letter was sufficient." Coming from him, Harriet suspected that was the highest praise imaginable. They walked back towards the house in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was filled with the unspoken reality of the work that lay ahead. As they reached the stable yard, he stopped. "The house is warmer," he stated. "Mrs. Ingram has found the will to light the fires," Harriet replied. "It is not Mrs. Ingram who found the will, Miss Lockhart. It is you who gave it to her." He looked towards the manor, where a plume of smoke now rose from a second chimney. "Continue your work." He mounted his horse in one fluid movement, nodded to her once more, and was gone, leaving Harriet standing in the yard with the scent of wood smoke in the air and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. Perspective of Gideon Devereux, Duke of Kestrel Chase. Gideon rode away from Sorrel Down. The image of the house with 2 plumes of smoke rising from its chimneys burned into his mind. It was a small thing, a ridiculously small thing. But in the cold, ordered world he inhabited, it was a signal as clear as a battle flag. He had bought Sorrel Down on a whim years ago, a piece to round out his county holdings. He had never intended to live there. It was an asset on a map, a line in a ledger. Its steady decline under a succession of useless men had been an irritation, a small, persistent failure that pricked at his sense of order. He had all but decided to sell it at a loss, to excise the annoyance, when he had found himself at the Bellamy's dinner table,
observing the quiet, gray girl with the intelligent eyes. He had seen her work before he ever spoke to her. It was in the effortless running of that household, in the way Sir Abbot could bloviate about finances he clearly didn't comprehend. Gideon, who had commanded men in the field, recognized the signs of a brilliant, invisible adjutant. He had seen it in the way she handled the humiliation of the spilled wine, not with tears or anger, but with the calm, methodical application of a solution. It was the thinking of an engineer, not a society miss. His offer had been an experiment, a gamble. He had given her an impossible task, expecting, on some level, for her to fail. He had expected letters of complaint, pleas for more funds, for help. He had expected her to be overwhelmed by the rot, both physical and moral, at the heart of the estate. Instead, he had received her report. It was the most remarkable document he had ever read. It was as clear and cold and precise as a surgeon's diagnosis.
No sentiment, no excuses, just facts, observations, and a plan. He had held the small packet of dried clay in his hand and felt a stir of something he hadn't felt since before the war, before the death of his wife, before his life had shuttered itself into a fortress of duty and control. It was a feeling of interest, genuine, sharp-edged interest. Now, seeing her standing in the muddy field, her dress hem spattered with dirt, her face animated as she spoke of drainage and clay strata, he knew his experiment was changing. She was not simply an employee or a contractor. She was a force of nature in her own right. She was bringing a dead thing back to life, not with money or commands, but with relentless intelligence and a quiet, unshakable will. He had felt the warmth in the house. It wasn't just the fires, it was a change in the very atmosphere. The place had a pulse now, a faint one, but it was there, and it was all her doing. He thought of the other women of his acquaintance, the simpering debutantes, the grasping mothers, the elegant but vapid society wives. They were like hothouse flowers, beautiful and useless. Harriet Lockhart was like the tough, resilient grass that grew on the high pastures of Sorrel Down, unassuming and utterly essential. He had told her to continue her work. The words were inadequate. What he had wanted to say was something else entirely, something he did not yet have the language for. He had come to Sorrel Down to inspect a failing asset. He was leaving, having witnessed a quiet miracle. And he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him to his very core, that he would be back. Harriet's success did not go unnoticed. The first sign was the arrival of a wagon from the Wedgwood Potteries, carrying two gentlemen in sober coats who spent a day taking core samples from the West Field under Harriet's watchful eye. They left with expressions of barely concealed excitement. A week later, a thick packet arrived, containing a draft contract for the exclusive rights to the Sorrel Down clay seam. The figures proposed made Harriet's breath catch. It was not just profit, it was a fortune. The second sign was more subtle. When she went to the market in Kingsbrook, people no longer looked through her. The butcher, who had previously served her with a surly indifference, now offered her the best cuts. The baker's wife, who had been a font of local gossip, now fell silent when she approached, her expression a mixture of respect and fear. Whispers followed her. The poor relation from the Bellamy house was performing some kind of alchemy at the ruined manor. Some said she was a genius. Others, their voices lower, said she was the Duke's mistress, and that he was pouring his own vast fortune into the estate. This rumor, she soon learned, was being fanned by a very specific source, Mr. Osmond Crane. Crane was a neighboring landowner, a man whose polished manners and fashionable waistcoats did not quite conceal a predatory watchfulness in his eyes. Harriet, in her deep dive through the old ledgers, had noted his name more than once. He had bought Sorreldown's timber and wool at suspiciously low prices from the thieving third steward. Her new, more businesslike arrangements had cut off that stream of easy income. Crane began to appear at the edge of her world. She would see him riding along the boundary of the estate, watching the work in the clay field. He once approached her near the village, tipping his hat with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Lockhart," he'd said, his voice smooth as cream. "One hears the most remarkable things. They say you have a magic touch. Or is it that the Duke's patronage is the magic?" "I have a contract, Mr. Crane," Harriet replied coolly, "and I have found that hard work is the only magic worth relying on." His smile tightened. "Indeed. But a woman in your position, so alone. Authority is a fragile thing. It can be here one day and gone the next." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. It was the opening move in a campaign. The social snubs escalated. An invitation to a harvest supper at a neighboring estate was mysteriously withdrawn. Lady Theodosia Vickers, a formidable old dowager whose lands bordered Sorreldown to the north, was heard to remark that it was highly irregular for an unmarried woman to be living and working in such a manner. Harriet knew that Crane and her aunt, Lady Bellamy, moved in the same social circles. The poison was spreading, a network of whispers and doubts designed to isolate and undermine her. The attack, when it came, was far more direct. Harriet had spent a month in painstaking negotiation with the pottery. The contract was ready. It would secure the estate's future. She had it on her desk, waiting only for a final signature from a director who was due to visit the following week. One morning, a flustered clerk from the pottery arrived on horseback. He bore a letter, not for Harriet, but for the foreman of the excavation crew. The foreman, a man named Perkin, brought it to her, his face pale with confusion. "Miss Lockhart, I don't understand. This came from the Duke's London office." Harriet took the letter. It was on thick, expensive paper, bearing the ducal seal of Kestrel Chase. The handwriting was a passable imitation of the Duke's curt, angular script. It was a single, brutal paragraph. "To the foreman of works at Sorreldown," it read. "The employment of Miss Harriet Lockhart is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Her authority is revoked. All works related to the clay extraction are to be suspended, pending the appointment of a new, qualified steward. All contracts negotiated by her are declared null and void." It was signed, simply, Kestrel Chase. The blood drained from Harriet's face. It was a forgery. It had to be. But it was a masterful one. The seal was perfect. The tone was exactly right. Cold, decisive, and utterly dismissive. It was designed to shatter her authority in a single blow. "What does it mean, miss?" Perkin asked, his voice trembling slightly. Harriet looked from the letter to the faces of the men who had gathered around. In the past months, she had earned their respect. She paid them on time. She listened to their expertise. She had provided them with better tools and safer working conditions. Now, in their eyes, she saw that hard-won respect beginning to curdle into doubt and fear. Their livelihoods depended on the Duke, not on her. "It means," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her, "that someone is attempting to sabotage our work." But the damage was done. The news spread through the estate like fire through dry grass. The work in the clay field ground to a halt. Mrs. Ingram was tight-lipped and worried, her newfound warmth replaced by a brittle anxiety. The fragile ecosystem of trust and progress Harriet had built was collapsing. Osmond Crane's words echoed in her mind. Authority is a fragile thing. It can be here one day and gone the next. She knew who was behind this. Crane, almost certainly, likely aided by her aunt's venom. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. The letter was a work of art. The local magistrate in Kingsbrook, a man easily swayed by the likes of Crane, would accept it as genuine. She was alone. The Duke was in London, a world away. She had his trust, she believed, but this letter was a direct assault on that trust. It was his name, his seal, his authority being used as a weapon against her. She sat in the steward's office, the fraudulent letter on the desk in front of her, the silence of the house pressing in. The scent of success had been replaced by the stench of failure. She had come so far, only to be brought down by a lie written on a piece of paper. For the first time since arriving at Sorrel Down, she felt the cold, sharp sting of despair. The Duke arrived 3 days later. He did not ride up the drive on his magnificent black horse. He arrived in a grim, mud-splattered traveling carriage, looking as if he had driven non-stop from London. Harriet saw the carriage from the office window, and her heart, which had been a heavy, leaden thing in her chest, began to beat with a painful, frantic rhythm. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Mrs. Ingram showed him into the office. He was still in his traveling coat, his face set like stone. He looked tired, angry, and dangerous. He dismissed the housekeeper with a curt nod and closed the door behind her. He did not greet Harriet. His eyes went straight to the letter which she had left lying on the center of the desk. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock, each tick a hammer blow against the anvil of Harriet's nerves. He walked to the desk, picked up the letter, and read it. His expression did not change. He held the paper for a long moment, then placed it carefully back on the desk. He lifted his gaze and looked at her. The air crackled with unspoken questions. He could destroy her with a single word. He could validate the lie and cast her out, just as the contract stipulated. All her work, her hopes, would turn to dust. He took a step closer, his pale gray eyes searching her face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and intense. "Did you believe I wrote this?" It was the only question that mattered. He was not asking if she had failed or if she had been careless. He was asking if she had doubted him. Harriet met his gaze without flinching. Her own voice was quiet but perfectly steady. "No," she said. "I did not." A flicker of something, relief perhaps, passed through his eyes. "Why not?" "Because it is illogical," she said, the words coming as precisely as the figures in her ledgers. "You would not terminate my employment and void a valuable contract via a letter to a foreman. You would have come yourself, or you would have written to me, stating your reasons and citing the evidence of my failure. You value evidence, Your Grace. This letter offers none, only a command." She paused, then added the final, damning detail. "And your signature, though a clever forgery, is incorrect. The loop on the G in Gideon is too round. Yours is flatter, more angular. I have seen it on our contract." The tension in the Duke's shoulders seemed to dissipate. He looked from her face to the letter, then back again. A slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. It was acceptance. Her defense was not an emotional plea,
but a logical analysis of his character. She had trusted not in his kindness, but in his nature. And she had been right. Osmond Crane, he said, the name a flat, cold statement of fact. And my aunt, I suspect, Harriet added. She has never forgiven me this opportunity. No, the Duke agreed, a new, harder edge to his voice. She has not. He looked around the small office, at the neat stacks of papers, the mended ledgers, the charts she had drawn up detailing the clay seam. He saw the evidence of her work, of her success, all threatened by this single piece of malicious paper. This will not stand, he said. It was a promise. They wished to put your authority on trial, Miss Lockhart. Very well. We will have a trial. But it will be on my terms. And it will be in public. He picked up the forged letter. The magistrate in Kingsbrook has requested my presence to clarify the situation. I will grant his request. I will call a public meeting at the town hall tomorrow at noon. I want you to be there, and I want you to bring your books. He looked at her, his eyes holding a glint of steel she had not seen before. All of them. The Kingsbrook Town Hall was a modest but imposing stone building, its assembly room filled with the low murmur of anticipation. The Duke's summons had been a command, and the notable figures of the district had all obeyed.
Merchants, landowners, the magistrate himself, they were all present. In a prominent position near the front sat Mr. Osmond Crane, looking composed and confident, occasionally leaning over to whisper to Lady Honora Bellamy, who sat beside him, a look of smug vindication on her face. Her daughter, Louisa, sat slightly behind them, looking uncomfortable and out of her depth. Harriet entered the hall a few moments after the Duke. She carried the first of several heavy boxes containing the Sorrel Down ledgers, followed by Jem and Perkin, their arms also laden. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on her. She was pale, but her back was straight, her expression composed. She walked to the large table at the front of the room and began to methodically unpack the books, arranging them in two distinct piles. The old, damaged, chaotic ledgers of the previous stewards, and her own set, neat, ordered, and precise. The Duke stood before them, a commanding figure of absolute stillness. He waited until the room was completely silent. "I have called you here to address a matter of some seriousness," he began, his voice clear and resonant. "It concerns the management of my estate, Sorrel Down, and the authority of its steward, Miss Harriet Lockhart." He held up the forged letter. "This document, purporting to be from me, was delivered last week. It claims to terminate Miss Lockhart's employment. I have been asked to verify its authenticity." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Osmond Crane. "This letter is a forgery." A gasp went through the crowd. Crane did not flinch, merely raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Your word against a document bearing your own seal?" "A clumsy one at that," the Duke continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "But it is not enough for me to simply state this. Guilt, like competence, requires evidence." He gestured to Harriet. "Miss Lockhart." It was her cue. Harriet stepped forward. She did not look at Crane or her aunt. She addressed the assembly. "For the past year, I have been rebuilding the financial records of Sorrel Down," she said, her voice steady and clear. She opened one of the old, ruined ledgers, its pages stained and torn. This was the state of the books when I arrived. They show years of neglect and theft. For example, Records show that in the last 2 years, over 300 tons of seasoned oak were sold from the estate's woodlands. She then opened one of her own, clean ledgers. My own survey of the woodlands, cross-referenced with the woodcutter's tally, shows that no more than 50 tons were felled. The remaining 250 tons existed only on paper, their sale a fiction to cover funds being stolen from the estate. She moved to the next set of books. For 3 years, the coarse wool from the sorrel-down flock was sold at a price less than half its market value. She held up a sheaf of receipts. All of them to a single buyer. Her eyes flicked, for just a second, to Osmond Crane. A buyer who, I discovered, was paying the former steward a handsome finder's fee for the privilege. She continued, her voice never wavering, as she laid out the facts one by one. She built a case brick by brick, not with accusations, but with numbers, dates, and cross-references. The room was utterly silent, captivated by the quiet woman in the plain dress, dismantling a web of corruption with irrefutable logic. When she finished, a new voice spoke up. It was Lady Theodosia Vickers, the elderly dowager, who had been watching the proceedings with sharp, intelligent eyes. "This is all very compelling, Miss Lockhart, but it does not prove who forged the letter." "You are correct, Lady Vickers," the Duke said. "It merely establishes motive. Mr. Crane's comfortable arrangement was disrupted by Miss Lockhart's competence." Crane rose to his feet, a look of polished outrage on his face. "This is a slanderous accusation, Your Grace. You have no proof that connects me to this forgery." "On the contrary," the Duke said, a dangerous calm settling over him. "I have a great deal of proof." He produced a document from his coat. "This is a sworn statement from a master engraver in London who examined the seal on the fraudulent letter. He confirms it was not made with my signet ring, but with a brass mould, likely cast from a wax impression. An impression such as one might obtain from a document sent to a neighbour." Crane's face lost a fraction of its colour. "Furthermore," the Duke continued, "I have a report from an expert in inks and paper, also from London. The paper is of a type not sold in this county, but it is sold by a stationer on Fleet Street, 2 doors down from the offices of a lawyer frequently employed by Lady Honora Bellamy." Lady Honora gave a strangled gasp, her face paling to a sickly white. "And finally," the Duke said, his voice dropping, "there is the matter of the signature." He looked directly at Harriet. "Miss Lockhart noticed an error in the forgery of my first name. A small detail, but a telling one. It is the kind of error one might make when copying a signature one has seen many times. A signature, for instance, on social correspondence. But I rarely sign my social letters with my first name. I sign them simply Kestrel Chase. The only people who would have multiple recent examples of my full signature, Gideon Devereux, would be those with whom I have recently signed a legal contract." He let the silence hang in the air, a devastating weight. He had signed only 2 such contracts in the county in the last year. One was with Harriet. The other was a land lease agreement with his neighbour, Mr. Osmond Crane. Crane stood frozen, his mask of civility finally shattered, exposing the raw panic beneath. The entire room was staring at him, the chain of evidence snapping shut, link by link. He was exposed, utterly and completely. Lady Honora looked as if she might faint, her social standing evaporating before her eyes. In the stunned silence of the hall, the Duke turned his back on the ruined men and women. He walked to the table where Harriet stood beside her ledgers. He stopped before her, and in front of everyone, he went down on one knee. The collective gasp was audible. "Miss Lockhart," Gideon Devereux said, his voice, which had been so hard and cold, now filled with a quiet, profound sincerity. "The contract is fulfilled. You have saved Sorrel Down. By our agreement, the estate is yours." He paused, his pale grey eyes fixed on her face. "But the contract is insufficient. It was a matter of business. This is not. An estate requires a partnership. I did not offer you this challenge to test an employee. I offered it because I saw in you a strength and honesty I thought no longer existed. I have not come here today to reclaim a property, Harriet. I have come to find my home." He took her hand, his grasp firm and warm. "I am asking, plainly, will you be my wife?" Tears she had refused to shed for cruelty or hardship now pricked at the back of her eyes. Tears of shock, of vindication, of a joy so vast it was painful. She looked down at the Duke, at this formidable, guarded man, kneeling before her on the dusty floor of the town hall. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her. He was not offering pity. He was offering partnership. Her voice, when she found it, was barely a whisper, but in the silent room it carried like a bell. "Plainly, Gideon," she said. "Yes." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. 2 years later, the light that filled the morning room at Sorrel Down was soft and golden, falling across a desk where 2 sets of hands rested, one over the other, on an open ledger. The book's columns were filled with Harriet's neat script, detailing the accounts of a thriving, prosperous estate.
The clay works were a resounding success. The home farm was a model of efficiency, and the Sorrel Down wool, now properly sorted and sold, commanded a premium price. The house itself was alive. The halls were warm, the windows gleamed, and the scent of beeswax and baking bread had long since replaced the smell of damp and decay. Mrs. Ingram, now a devoted ally and friend, ran the household with a cheerful, bustling authority, overseeing a staff that was loyal, well-paid, and proud. Harriet, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, looked down at her husband's hand covering hers. The quiet strength in his touch was a constant, reassuring presence in her life. He was no longer the cold, granite-faced man she had first met. The wariness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady warmth, a quiet joy that she knew was a mirror of her own. "The profit from the north pasture drainage is even better than we projected," she murmured, tapping a figure with her free hand. "Your projections are always too conservative," Gideon replied, his voice a low rumble near her ear. He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her temple. "You leave no room for your own brilliance." A letter lay on the corner of the desk, recently arrived from London. It was from Louisa. After the public humiliation at the town hall, Sir Abbot and Lady Honora had retreated from society. Their finances, without Harriet's shrewd management, had quickly faltered. They had been forced to sell their grand house and move to a small, respectable property in Bath, where Lady Honora's venom was confined to a much smaller pond. Osmond Crane had fled the country, his reputation and credit destroyed. Louisa, however, had surprised them all. Humbled and finally freed from her mother's ambitions, she had found a quiet strength of her own. She had married a country doctor, a good and earnest man, and her letters were no longer filled with gossip and fashion, but with news of her small garden, her work assisting her husband, and a genuine, if sometimes clumsy, interest in Harriet's life. This latest letter contained a pressed flower from her garden and a heartfelt, if poorly spelled, wish for their happiness. Harriet had found it in her heart to forgive her cousin. Some people were not wicked, merely weak, and deserved the chance at redemption. Later that day, Gideon found Harriet in the library. It was his favourite room in the house, a space that had once been cold and abandoned, now lined with his books from London and warmed by a perpetual fire. But she was not reading. She was standing before a new glass-fronted cabinet that had been installed on the main wall. Inside, carefully preserved, were the original ledgers of Sorrel Down. The stained, gnawed and torn books that had been the first evidence of the estate's decay. They were a testament to the chaos from which she had wrought order. She traced the line of a tear on the glass, her finger hovering over the place where she had put her first careful stitches, mending a page. Gideon came to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist. He followed her gaze. "A reminder," he said softly. "A beginning," she corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked at the ruined books, then at the beautiful, warm room around them, then up at her husband's face. She saw there the same story, a life brought back from ruin, a heart reopened, a future built not on inheritance or title, but on shared work and mutual respect. He looked down at her, his pale grey eyes filled with a love that needed no grand declarations. It was in his every look, his every touch. It was in the home they had built. "Together," he said. The word was a promise, a history, and a future, all in one. And in the quiet of the library, with the ghosts of the past laid to rest behind glass, Harriet knew she was, finally, truly, home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end.
Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.